Hello, and this is a double edition of Story of the Day. Unfortunately, I was having a few issues getting videos to record yesterday, so we have got a double bill of reading. We're going to finish George's Marvellous Medicine, and I'm going to introduce the new storybook to you. So, final chapter. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cupful of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, What's going on here, then? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice. I'll be blowed if I'm not going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. Sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho, ho, she cried, ha, ha, so that's your game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of tea in the morning, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I knew you were a selfish little boy. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it here. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman. He smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out her huge hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling her away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of George's hand and carried it high up, out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put a cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to a little old hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. You've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl like a goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears, and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky said. The boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran a few paces back. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high the shrill hurt their ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police. Man the hose pipes. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high off as the roof of the house, but she was coming down fast now. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right!" But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable little thing?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a pencil, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky yelled. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and shrinking fast. Moments later, no bigger a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely." "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone?" Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down pretty quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, well, I suppose it's for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Cranky. "She most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew that something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched, with the very tips of his fingers, the edge of the magic world. I hope you enjoyed that book, and the next book we're going to read is Michael Morpurgo's Casper, Prince of Cats. And here's the blurb. "They say cats have 9 lives, and certainly that's true of Casper. From the glorious suites of the Savoy Hotel to the servants' quarters in the attic, and from a crowded lifeboat to the hustle and bustle of New York City, Casper proves that no cat is too small for big adventures." The Coming of Casper. Prince Casper Kadinsky first came to the Savoy Hotel in a basket. I know, because I was the one who carried him. I carried all the Countess's luggage that morning, and I can tell you she had an awful lot of it. But I was a bellboy, so that was my job, to carry luggage, to open doors, to say good morning to the guests I met, to see and to meet their every need, from polishing their boots to bringing them telegrams. In whatever I did, I had to smile at them politely, but the smile had to be more respectful than friendly, and I had to remember all their names and titles too, which were not easy, because there were always newer guests arriving. Most importantly, though, as a bellboy, which, by the way, was just about the lowest of the low in a hotel, I had to do whatever the guests asked me to do, and right away. In fact, I was at almost everyone's beck and call. It was "Jump to it, Johnny," or "Be sharp about it, boy," or "Do this, lickety-split," or "Do that, yally-yally." They clicked their fingers at me, and I jumped to it lickety-split. I can tell you, particularly if Mrs. Blaze, the head housekeeper, was on the prowl. We could always hear her coming because she rattled like a skeleton on the move. This was on the account of the huge bunch of keys that hung from her waist. She had a voice as loud as a trombone, and she was angry. She was often angry. We lived in constant fear of her. Mrs. Blaze liked to be called Madame, but on the servants' corridor at the top of our hotel, where we all lived, bellboys, chambermaids, kitchen staff, we all called her Skullface, because she didn't just rattle like a skeleton, she looked like one too. We did our very best to keep out of her way. To her, any misdemeanour, however minor, was a dreadful crime. Slouching, untidy hair, dirty fingernails, yawning on duty was the worst crime of all. And that's just what Skullface had caught me doing the morning before the Countess had arrived. And tomorrow we'll pick up the rest of that chapter to find out a little bit more about Casper.